Can traditionally religious concepts like sin, salvation, and atonement and grace have anything to teach us about what's going on with the critical race theory conversation today? I actually think they can, and that's what I want to talk about.
Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz.
All right, so I'm going to move more in this part of the series now, part 4 here. I'm going to move more into some critiques, some questions, some concerns I have about the direction that the critical race theory conversation is kind of taking culturally. And I want to give so many caveats and disclaimers about the generalities of critical race theory and the differentiation between the academics side and the popularized side. I'm going to resist the urge to give all those caveats. Watch video 2 of this series if you haven't yet, in which I delineate between the descriptive and prescriptive sides of critical race theory. And no, just all I'm going to say is that as I get into this material for this video, I am commenting more on the prescriptive side, the prescriptive popularized side of critical race theory. Just know that. Again, if you want to know what I mean, watch video 2. I try to unpack that definition there. Because I want to get into some of these concepts here. I think these are important. These have been helpful for me to kind of illuminate part of the dynamics of what's going on. And actually, I want to start with, seems like coming out of left field, kind of circuitous route here. I want to start by actually talking a little bit about the life of Martin Luther, the famous German monk who pounded the 95 Theses on the door in Wittenberg, and sparked what would become the Protestant Reformation. Really, really important movement, especially culturally for the West, broadly speaking. That's that Martin Luther, that monk. I want to talk a little bit about him. And here I'm particularly following, there's lots of interpretations of Luther. I'm following Philip Carey's work in The Meaning of Protestant Theology, which I think is a really superb book, especially on this topic. So just know that I'm kind of what follows is informed a lot by his analysis of Luther. I'd recommend that book if this is of interest to you. Okay, let me get into it. So Martin Luther, known as a monk, known as a reformer, known as someone who challenged the kind of Catholic hegemony of the kind of medieval world. And like I said, sparked the Protestant Reformation. But here's a little bit about Martin Luther's life before that. He was an intense personality, and part of his conception of religion and God and salvation before his own kind of reformation that he experienced was that his understanding of what it meant to be assured, to listen to these concepts, they're going to come back, to be assured of one's salvation, to have confidence that one was in fact saved, experiencing salvation from God, to have confidence that one was properly saved, one had to have the same mindset of oneself as God has of you. I'm going to say that again. His conception was that he had to essentially agree with God in God's view of him in order to be assured that he was saved. And this is where it gets important. Martin Luther's understanding of God's view of him was that he was a wretch and a sinner, and that sin was inescapable, and he was inescapably entangled with it. There was nothing he could do about that. That was the reality into which he was born. Original sin was something over and above him that he was simply born into. Nevertheless, God's view of him was that he was helplessly bound up in sin, a corrupted sinner, wretch, and to be assured of his salvation, he needed to agree with God in that view of him. So, to the extent that Martin Luther could make himself agree with that view of himself from God's perspective as he understood it, if he could only be sure he was saved if he got himself to agree that that was the correct and proper view of him as a wretch, a sinner, hopelessly bound up in sin. You can maybe sense where I'm starting to go with this, but that was Martin Luther's life, was trying to convince himself that he was this horrible sinner, this despicable, lowly worm, and counterintuitively, that was the way he could experience salvation, or an assurance, a certainty, a confidence in his own salvation, was that he knew that he was a sinner. And so he just was spiritually kind of just like masochistic, and to convince himself that this was the deepest truth about him, and this is how God saw him, so that then he could experience confidence in being saved. So the more he just tried to convince himself that he was a terrible, terrible sinner, bound up in sin, and this created this loop in his soul, you could say, the spiritual struggles, that's a hard thing to try to internalize about oneself. It's so negative, it's so bleak. Nevertheless, he felt that was the road to salvation because that's how he was kind of theologically formed by the Church of Germany at the time. And so this created, as is well known, this created in Luther deep, deep anxiety. He probably would have been diagnosed as clinically depressed, maybe a bit obsessive, but certainly depressed and anxious. Just deep, difficult, terrible soul level struggles, because his journey was to keep trying to internalize this terrible self-image, because he believed that was God's image of him, and he believed that was how he could be saved, was to have the correct image of himself, namely God's image of him. And so this was Martin Luther's journey, to very overly simplify it. And his breakthrough in his journey came in his discovery through biblical texts, particularly books like Galatians and Romans, through the discovery of what? Of grace, of divine love, divine freely offered forgiveness towards him. This idea of actually the opposite of condemnation, this idea of forgiveness, this idea of rescue, coming from the divine to him without him earning it, but actually just being offered to him. I'm sorry if you're not a Christian and this is all really boring for you, but I think it's going to, I promise, relate to the critical race theory topic. But Luther's discovery of grace and that freely offered forgiveness broke that spiritual self-masochistic cycle of trying to convince himself he was this terrible sinner so that he could get this assurance of salvation. Grace, forgiveness, love, divinely sourced is what broke that open for Luther. So that's a really, really truncated version of part of Luther's spiritual journey and spiritual life. And it's a powerful thing. It's a powerful experience. Now, as with anything these days, you have to put a caveat. You can't, simplistically endorse all things from Martin Luther. I don't endorse everything Martin Luther says, certainly not things he said at the end of his life. So just know that's there. But I think this insight is really, really apropos to part of what we're struggling with culturally. This insight of this difference between his journey pre-grace and his journey post-grace and his freedom there. And that's where I want to link this up. So some of these religious concepts under the surface here for Luther were concepts of, sin, original sin, and kind of the universal ubiquity of sin. Sin was real, and we participate in sin, but it's not something that we can escape. It's something that we're born into in biblical language because of Adam, because of being born in Adam, being a human. We are born into sin. So it's universal, it's ubiquitous, it's inescapable. And nevertheless, there was something known as salvation, and there was an assurance and a confidence and a freedom of salvation that was worth pursuing. It's just that the way Luther believed you pursued that changed radically when he discovered grace. So his pursuance of an assurance of salvation believed trying to internalize this bleak self-image until he discovered divine grace. So sin, salvation, grace, forgiveness, universal sin, these are all really important concepts that I would argue, to link this to what's going on today, I would argue a lot of these concepts are still operative today in a lot of our conversation, but we obviously don't use those terms because the religious baggage and connotations of those terms, it just doesn't make sense in our kind of cultural milieu right now. And so even though we're not using terms like sin or salvation or atonement or grace so much, I think they're still at work. And this is what I want to unpack now as I kind of bring this video to a close. So critical race theory, popular prescriptive critical race theory, has done some really good things, I would argue. It's deeply increased awareness, particularly in culturally privileged populations like white people or white men especially. It's really tried to drive home this increased awareness of bigger structural realities around us. It's tried to drive home an awareness of the historical underpinnings of structures and social laws and institutions, an awareness that these things come out of a history, and a deeply troubled history that has privileged certain populations and marginalized others, and just an awareness that these structures are bigger than us and around us, and there are things that we participate in and are born into. It's driven up an awareness of all that. This is all good. It's driven up an awareness of one's social location within those structures. It's driven up an awareness that one doesn't control one's social location, particularly by virtue of where one is born. None of us control those things. We're born into a certain place that, again, has structures and history and injustices tied up in all of that. This is all awareness of things that critical race theory, popularized critical race theory especially, has contributed to, I would argue, Insofar as it's just limited to those things I just said, it's a positive move. I'm grateful for being more deeply aware of social structures and my own social location within them. So these are good things. But here's where I want to link up the concepts that Martin Luther was wrestling with the concepts we're wrestling with today. Because I would argue that white supremacy, as it's talked about in those social histories and social structures and social location, white supremacy has in some ways replaced the notion of original sin and sin more broadly in our cultural conversations. And so language like Robin DiAngelo talks about white supremacy being kind of at the foundational bedrock of all of our social structures, right? In America, at least. And so this notion that, this is where hopefully it's starting to link up, these terms are starting to link up for you as you're watching this, but this notion that white supremacy is kind of in the air, in the atmosphere, and it's baked into our social structures, and by no fault of our own, she actually talks about this in White Fragility as well. She basically says, if you're white and you're reading this, you are a racist, and it's not your fault. It just is who you are. It's what you're born into. There's this resonance between this idea of being born into a white supremacist structure and a white supremacist social situation through no fault of your own, but you're still born into it. Between that and Martin Luther's concept of being born into original sin, the sin of Adam, the world that is covered entangled in sin. We're not at fault, but we are born into it and we participate in it and we're complicit in it, to use a term that's popular in our current dialogue. And so I think there's this interesting kind of definitional resonance between white supremacist social structures and racist structures, to use the more general term, that racism is just so embedded in our society and it's the air that we breathe and we move into it and it's not our fault, but we still do. And the idea that in Martin Luther's age you were born into sin and there's nothing you can do about it. Then to go another level further, this sin is inescapable. As it was for Martin Luther, it's inescapable, and as it is for Robin DiAngelo, white supremacy and racism, if you're born into a privileged social location, if you're born as a white person in America, it's inescapable. You have been born into a racist way of experiencing the world, and that has formed you and shaped you in your understanding to such an extent that it's just simply inescapable. You cannot claim to have escaped it. And in fact, and this is where I have real philosophical issues with books like White Fragility, but in fact, if you as a white person assert that you are, if you assert that you're not racist, or if you assert that you have escaped the effects of white supremacy, that is actually evidence of your own fragility and the fact that you cannot actually engage with the topic well or healthily. That's what she would say. That's argued very explicitly in the book. And so that gets tricky. That's a kind of an epistemological trap. Nevertheless, that's not what this video is about, but I'm gonna get to that as I get to my final questions here. But I'm just trying to point out the connections between the universal sin, original sin notion that's inescapable, and then the universal kind of racism, white supremacist notion that we're born into that's similarly inescapable in our context. And let's talk about salvation and atonement for a second, because Martin Luther believed salvation was still worth pursuing, and he tried to pursue it by internalizing this bleak self-image, accepting this notion of his kind of sinner's state. And I would argue that there is still an operative notion of salvation happening in these conversations about race and society today. And my experience in both kind of being through a lot of this way of thinking, and you can watch I have a series of videos on my journey through anti-racism that chronicles some of that, if that's of interest to you. But my experience of kind of going through being inculcated in these ways of thinking about the world, I would argue that there is a notion of salvation at work, and it's to, it's to be woke, to be able to say that you are awake to these dynamics, you are awake to the ways that white supremacy operates in the world, and you are aware of it and you understand it, and you're doing the work, so to speak, to divest yourself of your white privilege and all of that. This is a way of signaling that you are, well, I think I would say that you are experiencing salvation in this social sense. Again, no one uses the term salvation, but I think it's taking on that meaning. Because everyone wants, if you're in this mode or in this culture, in this world, you want to be saved. You want to be a good white person, so to speak. And so therefore you want to have achieved that status. And I really believe that there is a kind of a salvific sense to it. There's no divine source. Which is one of the questions that might be asked. There's no divine source of this. And it's, but it nevertheless is a type of salvation at work. So there's a lot of clamoring and working to achieve this salvation status as Martin Luther worked and worked and worked to internalize this notion of his sinful status so that he could be assured that he was saved. And so in our current context, how does a white person, generally, how does a white person achieve an assurance of their own salvation? Well, I think, in this popularized, prescriptive, kind of simplistic, philosophically simplistic kind of operation of critical race theory, a white person achieves this assurance of their own salvation if they too, just like Martin Luther, if they too can internalize this negative image of their own status as a helpless contributor to white supremacist structures in the state, right? So to the extent that someone like me can internalize this really, really bleak negative image that white supremacy is at the bottom, operative in all of our social structures. There's nothing we can do about it. It's historically beyond me, institutionally beyond me. Nevertheless, as a white person who's born into those structures, if I can accept the fact that I contribute to it, I am complicit in all of it, then therefore I am racist and I am white supremacist. Whether or not I actually have prejudice or bias myself, just by contributing to all of this, I am all those things. To the extent that I can internalize and accept that about myself, accept that negative pronouncement about who I am, to the extent I can accept that, then I've achieved what I would call salvation in the popular critical race theory sense. And I think there's a really, really fascinating resonance, again, between Martin Luther's journey and this journey, at least his pre-grace journey. And so I want to ask, what I'm seeing and what I'm analyzing here has any accuracy to it, then that means that to achieve salvation is to align with the popular kind of view in the rhetoric. And so I want to end this video on asking just some questions about that I think are really, really important to slow down and examine, because this kind of way of thinking is pretty rampant in certain circles. And so one question I want to ask, which is really just two questions. I want to end on two questions here for thought before getting into further videos in the series. One is sin truly universal or not? And by that I mean, for Martin Luther, sin was a human-wide reality. And so for him, he was born into it because he was human, right? The sin of Adam. Adam just comes from the Hebrew word Adam, which just means human, right? So because of being born into Adam, so to speak, being born as a human, he was part of sin. There's a distinction between between that and what we're wrestling with today, and that is the racialized kind of notion of it, because who is actually born into or culpable or complicit in white supremacy? Is it all people? Is it universal in the sense that original sin was, or not? My sense is that it's definitely not. And how then, if it's not universal, how then do you delineate or adjudicate who is a participant in it and who isn't? And from what I see, it's a lot of using identity to demarcate who is actually a participant in this sinful state and who isn't, right? So that's a question. That's a real troubling question, I think, to consider. So that's question number one. Is sin universal or not? At bottom, is sin, if you use that if you want to use another word for it, is brokenness, is injustice, is it universal or not? Do humans universally contribute to it and participate in it or not? Question number two, then, with Martin Luther's story as a guide, then what is the role of grace, forgiveness, mercy, reconciliation, and love? What is the role for any of those terms in this system, right? This popularized critical race theory system, prescriptive system. Grace, love, forgiveness. What's the role of that? Some people, to be sure, some people would say there is a role for it. So I'm not trying to throw kind of the whole topic out. But I think it's really, really important, particularly in the Rabban DeAngelonian sense, in the Ibram Kendi kind of way of interpreting all these things. What's the role of that? For Martin Luther, the role was to break this super self-damaging pattern of internalizing this masochistic idea, these bleak ideas about himself, so that he could achieve assurance. For him, that's what divinely sourced grace, mercy, and love did. But in our world today, if the task is to construct a more just society, a more aware society, if the task is to truly make people really more equal, genuinely so, what might be the role of divine love, forgiveness, salvation in that journey, particularly if you define the world as white supremacist from top to bottom, and it's inescapable, and it's going to take certain, and if your definition of that is that certain people then need to awaken to those dynamics, who are those people, and then what's the role of mercy? What's the role of forgiveness? What's the role of love? And I'm going to end the video by leaving that open-ended. I'm going to leave it open intentionally because I think it's worth pondering, and it's something that I am increasingly wrestling with. I'm a religious person, so I have a whole host of transcendent categories and concepts that I bring into that conversation, but for a truly secularized system, what's the role of those things? What could that look like? If you're not a Christian or you're not religious and you're watching this and you have responses to that, either of those questions, post them below. Let me know. If it stirs up other questions for you, other ways you'd like me to continue to explore the topic of critical race theory, then similarly post them below. I'm enjoying going into this series, and I do want to do some more videos, particularly as we look into some of these critiques, and we'll look into some of the philosophical kind of underpinnings that are at work in popular critical race theory. Those are things I'd like to talk about. So thanks again for watching. Hope that you found this at least thought-provoking. Thank you.